Australia's cooked. Remember when everyone was proud to call themselves Australians? When mateship actually meant something? When Aussies actually stood shoulder to shoulder, willing to defend this country with their lives? Well, that's all gone. Now it's every man for themselves, and a fair go for all has turned into a fair go for some. Greed and speculation rule the day, and we've created a two-tier wealth system where the rich get richer, while millions of Australians are completely locked out from ever being able to afford their own home. I'm Biko Konstantinos, and that's what we're going to talk about today. A grasshopper walks into a bar. The bartender laughs and says, "Hey, we've got a drink named after you." The grasshopper turns to the bartender and with a look of extreme confusion, he says, "You have a drink called Steve?" And you'll definitely want to drink after listening to my content. So why don't you like this video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'll keep you updated on the big financial stuff that affects your life. Now let's see how Australia's become cooked from the inside out. For today's video, I'm going to look at sections from Matt Barry's keynote speech in Brisbane titled "Put Another Aussie on the Barbie." Now I recommend you check out the entire video, which goes for an hour and 20 minutes, because Matt Barry is not only a successful businessman, but is also one of the few Australians who speaks out against the housing Ponzi.
Let's start by acknowledging an uncomfortable truth. Australia's past is a foreign country.
Yep, we've changed so much in such a short period of time. Today's Australia does not even resemble the Australia of old.
Once upon a time, Australia was a country not only renowned, but defined through our sense of mateship. Tourism Australia used to proclaim it as the beating heart of the Australian spirit. Mateship was an Australian military virtue.
That's the Australia that I remember when I was growing up. All the kids in the street used to get together after school and just hang out, play cricket, ride our bikes, and generally just have fun together. It didn't matter what nationality you are. I feel like we all had this collective identity of being Australians. I mean, my parents grew up in Biloela and Monto, Queensland, but they definitely felt Australian and they passed that on to me.
Yet today, despite record population growth, where Australia adds a Canberra and a Darwin combined every year, our military faces crippling shortages. Nobody wants to fight for the army.
Why do you think no one wants to fight in the Australian army anymore? Would you volunteer to defend this country with your life? When policies are continuously implemented, making the lives of Australians so much worse, it's no wonder army recruits are in short order.
If the erosion of our freedoms and sense of self wasn't enough, Australians are grappling with the highest tax hike in the developed world. Taxes are up 7.6% in the last year alone, while we're also facing the biggest decline in living standards in the OECD, with gross household disposable incomes falling 6.1% in the worst per capita recession since the Great Depression.
So basically Australians are getting right royally screwed, unless you own property, baby. Australia's not a country with a housing market, it's a housing market with a country.
Once upon a time, we believed in the great Australian dream, where home ownership could lead to a better life and was an expression of success and security.
But the funny thing was that it wasn't even a dream. Australians felt comfortable that they could own their own home because they were so affordable. Back in the 70s and 80s, it was the norm for a household to just have one person working and they could still easily afford to buy their own home, and paying it off wasn't even that difficult. And the income earner didn't have to work overtime or get a second job or a side hustle or anything like that. They would come home, read the paper, play with the kids, and basically just live their lives. And because they had that security of being able to own their own home, Australians felt confident to start a family, and the average household often included 2 or 3 kids.
That dream is now impossible for the average person, not because of one's lack of talent, skill, or ability, but because of simple mathematics.
Impossible to realise the dream of home ownership when just 20 to 30 years ago it was available to everyone. How could Australian policymakers allow that dream to be totally destroyed in such a short period of time? Home ownership provides the basis for financial security, because if you're able to buy a home and pay it off before you retire, then you're able to retire without one of the biggest expenses, which is accommodation. It's like a giant rug pull. One day all Australians are standing on the rug, which represents home ownership, and then all of a sudden the rug gets pulled and now that dream is just a fading memory.
In Sydney now, it takes 46 years to save for an average house deposit, not the house, the deposit.
This is an absolute disgrace, and I can't believe it's been allowed to happen without uproar and outrage. I mean, Matt Barry's talking about it, but why aren't we seeing other high-profile gurus talking about it? Why isn't the mainstream media going hell for leather reporting this crisis? Because it's one of the biggest factors that's negatively affecting millions of Australians right now. And I think I know the answer. Most Australians own property, and they're actually over the moon to see these ridiculous, insane prices. They're overcome by their own greed and willing to sacrifice entire generations just so the housing bubble can continue.
Lee Kuan Yew, former Prime Minister of Singapore, soon after separation, I resolved to enable every household to own its own home. If we were going to get people to take national service seriously, I could not ask their sons to fight for the properties of the wealthy.
What a statement. If you can't afford to own a piece of this country that you live in, how could that country ask you to defend it? Whether or not you feel the Singapore housing market has been done well, having a leader who really prioritizes home ownership is something bloody great. In Australia, it's so far from a priority, it's not funny. The only priority I see is pumping the housing Ponzi as far as it possibly can go to squeeze every bit of speculative gain they can get out of the market. That's Australia's obsession, and I see no evidence of any real change on the horizon.
It's no surprise that people don't want to fight for this country anymore. Australia has gone from embodying the selfless Anzac spirit, where sacrifice for the greater good and future generations was a sacred duty, to a nation that seems all too willing to sacrifice everybody's future.
I mean, what would the Anzacs think now if they saw what was happening in the country, where hardworking citizens, including frontline workers such as nurses and teachers, can no longer actually afford their own home, where property investors get the most generous tax concessions in the entire world, which enables them to easily outbid first home buyers, which is creating a massive wealth gap and a two-tiered wealth society.
The dream of home ownership, once a cornerstone of Australian identity and aspiration, has gone. Blind Freddie can tell you this is not sustainable.
It isn't sustainable because more and more Australians will be forced to rent, and as rent prices keep increasing along with the cost of living, they're basically pushed towards the poverty line and at risk of homelessness. Now, in the past, this might have been the minority, but what's the government going to do when millions of renters retire and have to keep on renting? The pension isn't going to be enough to cover rent plus living expenses. Will the government just push millions of Australians onto the streets? This is why the current trajectory of house prices isn't sustainable.
No, this is not a country, not by any means a functional country. Australian politicians have wrecked this great nation. They have created the mother of all property bubbles on a scale like no other.
Like I said, I'm baffled that successive Australian governments have watched on while this housing bubble has continuously been inflated to levels never ever seen before. Bill Shorten seemed to be the only politician in recent history who really tried to reform the housing market by reducing some of that speculative demand. But of course that was voted down because no one messes with Australia's housing gravy train. And if you try to, they'll come after you with a vengeance.
That is now desperately being propped up by the mother of all immigration programs, causing a cost of living crisis, a deterioration in Australian wealth, and a deterioration of our high trust society, a deterioration of our culture, and a deterioration of our way of life at a pace that is unlike anything the country has seen before.
So the mother of all immigration programs, which no Australian asked for, seems to have made everything exponentially worse.
People are being forced to live in tent cities, which are mushrooming all over Australia, as rental vacancies collapse to historic lows.
This is something I've never witnessed in my entire life, and when I read stories of full-time workers having to live in tents, that would have been absolutely unbelievable to me just 10-20 years ago. It would have never crossed my mind that Australia could be in this situation, and I don't understand as a country how we allowed vacancy rates to get under 1% when a vacancy rate of around 3% is considered healthy for a rental market.
We're being lied to and gaslit about the reasons for the astronomical cost of our housing. Our immigration minister and economists tell us the problem is we need more migrants to build more homes for more migrants.
So record levels of migrants are coming, of which very few are building houses, and all those migrants need a place to live, so we need more migrants, of which not many will build houses. I don't know about you, but I don't get that logic.
No, the actual reason for the housing catastrophe is straightforward. It's basic supply and demand.
If housing supply supply was high in Australia and overall demand was very low, house prices would be much lower and they wouldn't grow in value anywhere near the levels we've seen in recent years. But that is absolutely not the case in Australia. Australian property has some of the craziest demand in the entire world, so let's consider the reasons why. First, owning your own home is the great Australian dream, and renting sucks balls in Australia, so everyone wants a home of their own. House prices have massively outperformed wages since the late 1990s. So if you had the choice of parking your money in the bank and earning less than 1% interest, or parking your money into property and seeing that property value rise 7 to 10% every year, and that's on the total house price, not just the small deposit you've got in the bank, you very quickly realize that property's the way to go and sink as much as you possibly can into it. There's no capital gains tax payable on any value rises on your own home that you live in. You can negatively gear to buy an investment property, and if you do own an investment property, all you have to do is hold it for 12 months and you only pay tax on 50% of any capital gain that you make. Wealthy foreigners love parking their money in Australian property. One, because it's safe, as in propped up by government policies and low interest rates. But the other thing is a long history of ridiculous capital gains. And lastly, mass migration levels means that we don't have enough housing stock for all the people that are coming in, and this creates insane demand for housing, because housing isn't just a luxury item like a handbag. A safe shelter is a basic requirement for life.
There is no latent demand in Australia for additional housing. No, the astronomical demand is entirely coming from a totally out of control, uncalibrated, untargeted and unhinged immigration program.
Matt's spot on. Australia's birth rate has been under replacement level for many decades now. So if we didn't have immigration, our population levels would be actually decreasing. And then no one would have to say it's a supply issue. So who decided in the 2000s that immigration levels really needed to start ramping up? And who decided just a few years ago that they needed to be pushed to ballistic levels?
I'm sick of being lied to about the reasons we're losing the social and cultural fabric of Australian society, aren't you?
Yes, I bloody well am sick of it, Matt. I'm sick of being told it's a supply issue and we just need to build more houses. What we need is more leaders who think like the Singapore Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew. My primary preoccupation was to give every citizen a stake in the country and its future. I wanted a home-owning society, and that's exactly what I'd like to see in Australia. I'm Biko Konstantinos.